In a Nuzlocke, any Pokemon that faints has to be boxed forever, and I'm gonna try to beat Pokemon Scarlet, attempting to get all the way to the final boss while only allowed to catch one of each grass type in the game. And let me tell you, grass struggles a lot versus the immense boss lineup of this game. All the spicy Nuzlocke rules are down in the description below, but importantly, I won't be allowed to use any setup moves. Additionally, I'm not allowed to change my type by terastalizing, but you're definitely allowed to change the color of that subscribe button. Of course, my starter is Sprigatito, and Sprigatito's a fantastic Pokemon. The only issue is we immediately need an answer for Katie's bug types, and my solution is luckily right next to her gym. After about an hour of searching, I find the rare and elusive Eevee. I then take a quick detour to Tag Tree Thicket where there's a free leaf stone just lying on the ground. This lets me evolve it into Leafeon, the second coolest evolution only after Jolteon, the objectively most awesome evolution, but hey, feel free to be wrong in the comments. Leafeon is still at a type disadvantage versus Katie, so I make sure to fight 5 students so that this guy gives me the TM for Aerial Ace. The reason I'm not too worried about Leafeon's bug weakness is because of its massive defense stat. Katie's first 2 Pokemon can be knocked out with 1 Aerial Ace each, and her ace Teddiursa only has physical attack, so even though it lands a critical hit with Fury Cutter, Leafeon is completely fine. Now that's gaming. And speaking of high-level gaming, while I prepare for the next boss, let me introduce you to this video's sponsor, Red Magic, a series of smartphones committed to providing players the ultimate gaming experience. And they just released their latest model, the Red Magic 9 Pro, an absolute beast of a gaming unit. And with the latest Snapdragon 8 Gen 3 processor, performance is 30% smoother than it's ever been before. To stress test it, I booted up Bloon's tower defense and spammed as many laggy towers I could get my hands on. But after several hours of desperately fishing for a lag spike, I failed and simply had an awesome time gaming. Playing Pokemon Unite feels even better than playing on the Switch, with awesome new 4D vibration for better immersion and perfect performance, which aside from the new processor is probably due to the Red Magic 9 Pro's crazy Ice 13 cooling system to reduce heat more than ever before, and the massive 16 gigabytes of RAM. That's like a little gaming computer that goes in your pocket. It's not that little though, with a 6.8-inch screen big enough to make gaming a great 120Hz experience, but still fitting comfortably in your pocket. With new multi-volume controls, you can listen to music while you game, so with 3 awesome designs to pick from, I truly recommend the Red Magic 9 Pro to anyone who wants to game on the go. So check out the link in the description and pinned comment below to pick yours up today, and let's get back to the video. With the first gym defeated, we've got to take on Cloth before we can take on the second. Unfortunately for the giant crustacean, Titan Cloth is probably the most pathetic boss in the entire game. Pair that with its crippling weakness to grass, and we topple it over in a matter of moves. It gives Aster the experience to evolve into Florigato, but my plan to beat my fellow grass-type trainer Brassius involves a different kitty. Now, while we still have access to Aerial Ace, we can actually get the much stronger X-Scissor by just roaming the world. It's not quite enough to one-shot Petalil, but Sleep Powder doesn't work against my grass types anyway. This means the most dangerous thing Brassius has to throw at me is rocks with Sudowoodo, and since we've already established Leafeon has awesome defenses, yeah, this gym fight can't really touch us. What's coming up next is a much bigger problem, our first encounter with Team Star and the Open Sky Titan. And unfortunately, there's just not a lot of grass types we can get below the level cap of 20. I begin by backtracking a bit and capturing a Hoppip. From there, I capture a Sunkern, and while I am able to find a Sunstone in a Sado Desert to immediately evolve it, Sunflora is about as uninspiring as a grass type could possibly be. I also backtrack to pick up a Skiddo before taking on Giacomo of Team Star. And look, this fight is always bullshit. Unless you've got something to resist dark or something that's super effective against it, you're pretty much screwed. His lead Poniard definitely isn't the problem though, since we can just dig, dodge an Aerial Ace, and then take it out the following turn. Now the issue is of course his Starmobile. These things have very inflated stats and are unaffected by pretty much everything that isn't a damaging move. Now Leafeon is at least very bulky, baiting out a metal sound, but even a super effective X-Scissor doesn't deal too much damage. I swap out into Sunflora since Snarl would deal a lot after that metal sound. Sunflora is able to tank a Wicked Torque, but since we can't set up something useful like Leech Seed, Sunflora basically can't touch it back. Despite Sunflora being almost completely useless, I decide to keep it around since Go-Goat evolves way later. Either way, this inevitably means the first death of the run. After Skiddo goes down, I swap back in Buttercup, who now isn't intimidated and thus will do a little bit more damage with X-Scissor. I really didn't want to switch out since at this point I was still hoping for no further casualties, so I stay in to tank the next Snarl, which does over 50%. This means I'm unable to stay in with Leafeon, so I'm forced to sacrifice Sunflower anyway. Sunflora desperately hangs on by dodging the attack, but the second Snarl connects, and unfortunately she falls. My Hoppip literally won't be able to do anything, so I swap in Florigato. I'm immediately struck by a metal sound, but that gives me a free turn to use Low Kick. The Snarl then connects, but the special attack of the Starmobile isn't particularly good, so Aster manages to survive on 26 HP, which means for now we can at least avoid suffering any further casualties. I'd love to catch some more Pokemon, but most are unfortunately just too high level. I am able to collect a Smoliv, which won't be much help against the Open Sky Titan. I also capture a Deerling, but I don't see it being too useful either. Sadly, neither will Shroomish, since even if I could evolve it, it would be quad weak to flying. The only actual useful encounter I can pick up is right next to the bird, Petalil. Because we can scour the desert for another Sunstone, we can already evolve it into Lilligant. I also evolved Dandelion into Skiploom, but Lilligant is going to be a lot more useful going into the fight versus Bombardier, because Lilligant is just bulky enough to survive a pluck, and luckily I managed to land a Sleep Powder. And because the Titan Pokemon aren't as blatantly unfair as the Starmobiles, you are actually able to inflict status conditions, which lets me set up Leech Seed. This won't really help Lilligant survive another hit since she'd have to get back to full HP, but it sets us up to maybe take a couple more hits with Leafeon. Before switching, however, I take a bit of a risk to confuse Bombardier with Teeter Dance and then swap out into Leafeon. Unfortunately, the timing isn't great, and this is the turn that Bombardier wakes up, but because of the confusion, it just ends up hitting itself. Bombardier does outspeed Leafeon and break through confusion the next turn, but it just goes for Rock Throw instead of Pluck, dealing barely any damage at all. In fact, with Leech Seed recovery, I almost get back all the way to full health. From there, I get unlucky with the coin flip once again, and Bombardier breaks through, hitting me with a Pluck for almost half of my health. However, Pluck activates Rocky Helmet, which is enough to take Bombardier into the second phase of the fight. Now, unfortunately, this is by far the most ruthless Titan battle in the game, since you're not allowed to heal in between the two phases. So even though I managed to get through the first phase without actually losing a Pokemon, it's unlikely that's going to be the case this time, particularly since the Titan Pokemon has twice as much HP in the second phase. Because Lilligant was at such low health, I was forced to switch, which unfortunately means the demise for Deerling. I knew there wouldn't be a way for me to get through this without any casualties, but it still stinks. I send in Buttercup, who's not looking too hot in the health department either, but Bombardier decides to wing attack Knackley. This gives me the chance to hit the flying dark type with a neutral X-Scissor for pretty decent damage. Arvin is already faster, but insists on continuing to go for Rock Polish, putting me at further risk. And while Buttercup does survive, I definitely need to swap out the next turn. I send in Smoliv since everything on my team goes down to Pluck, but Arvin decides to actually be useful and outspeeds with the Smackdown for the KO. That fight definitely went way better than I expected. Our next opponent, Iono, is a lot easier to prepare for. All I have to do is pick up a Capsicid, which I can evolve immediately with a Firestone. Gotta love the sassy little T-Rex arms in this guy. Iono, definitely one of our better matchups in the game since Grass resists Electric. Her lead Wattrel is simply outmatched by Scovillain, torching it immediately with a Flamethrower. In comes Luxio, so I swap out into Leafeon to take it out with a single dig. Her Avocado Frog is able to tank a few hits, but because it only has moves that we resist, it's a very easy KO as well, leaving her only with Mismagius. Now sadly, my Lilligant has Chlorophyll and not Own Tempo, in which case it would just completely wall this thing. Buttercup does have a Person Berry, and I was expecting Confuse Ray, which is why I stayed in for the Leech Seed, but Buttercup almost gets taken out by a Hex instead. Now that we got the Leech Seed out, I swap out into Lilligant, who's got the Assault Vest equipped, meaning that Hex barely does any damage at all. Because Hex is the most threatening thing Mismagius can do to Lily, it's extremely safe to just stay in and lock myself into Petal Dance. I'm able to stay healthy with Leech Seed, and even if I do get confused, which is exactly what happens the next turn, I won't deal too much damage to myself if I hit myself, because Lilligant's physical attack is terrible. Lily saves me some time though by just not getting hit by confusion and taking out Mismagius with a Petal Dance for the third badge. But with Iono defeated, we've got one of our worst matchups ahead of us. Evolving Shroomish into Breloom doesn't help us very much when our next opponent is the Fire-type user Mela, and because this is a Team Star battle, we have access to very few tactics. So in order to pick up a few more Pokemon, I head to the Teal Mask. Here I can find some awesome Pokemon like Applin, and some less useful ones like Sewaddle, which is quad weak to fire. I then go on the hunt for a Lotad, and sadly the lowest level one I could find was exactly at the level cap at 27, meaning I won't be able to evolve it. Because the DLC is so new, I thought this was the only place you could find Lotad. This goes to show exactly how important game knowledge is for Nuzlockes, since if I had access to Ludicolo, the following fight wouldn't cost me as dearly. Not only does Mela have her obnoxious obnoxious Starmobile, her lead Torkoal even sets up the Sun. This is incredibly bad since all but 2 of my Pokemon get torn to shreds by Fire-type moves. And in the Sun, Lotad is just barely able to hang on after a Flame Wheel on 2 HP to then set up the Rain. Swift Swim Ludicolo would have just outsped Torkoal the next turn and taken it out with a Surf, but since we don't have it, we've got to swap out into Poppy. Unfortunately, Torkoal's only other move is Clear Smog, which deals a whole ton of damage. At least it doesn't do over half so that Poppy can stay in and get off a Leech Seed. Unless I want to lose Breloom, I definitely have to switch, so I send in Scovillain. We still take about a quarter from Clear Smog, but with the recovery from Leech Seed, it's a lot more manageable. Torkoal's physical bulk is incredibly annoying since we've wasted all 5 of our rain turns already, and Fire-type moves are back on the menu. I am able to take Torkoal out the following turn, but now we've got to deal with her full power Starmobile. And from here, I don't have much of a choice. All I can do is fire off damaging moves at this thing and hope I take it out before I run out of Pokemon. And based off the damage from a Stomping Tantrum, things aren't looking good. Because Scovillain got screeched, I'm forced to swap out, going into Leafeon since it's the only mon that can kinda take a hit, but it gets burned. This was devastating, since Leafeon could have at least done some decent damage with Dig, but now its only fate is to be the next casualty of the run. Because of this stupid Starmobile, I can't even go for something useful like Leech Seed, so I'm forced to just try for the damage anyway. Mela does miss her first Overheat, allowing me 1 Dig for some pretty pathetic damage, but I'll take what I can get. Leafeon then gets absolutely torched, so I send in Scovillain, who immediately gets screeched again. At least I can go for another Stomping Tantrum, finally taking the Starmobile into the yellow. Since Scovillain is kinda my only hope, I'm forced to swap out into Lily, who also sadly goes down. Scovillain comes back and once again gets screeched, allowing me another Stomping Tantrum. But alas, I'm once again forced to swap out, this time sacrificing Lotad. With half of my team lost, I'm starting to run out of Pokemon to sacrifice. For the 4th time, Azalea gets screeched so we can take the Starmobile into the red. Sadly, at this point, I have to let Scovillain go. My only 2 remaining Pokemon are Breloom and Floragato, which I really can't afford to lose to have any type of chance with the rest of the run. Luckily, Floragato won't get one-shot by Blazing Torque, so the Starmobile opts for Screech. So I go for the Bite, but it's not quite enough. I'm forced to try with Quick Attack, and luckily, it takes out the Starmobile's remaining health to win me the fight. Because we lost Scovillain in that absolute massacre, the Orthworm Titan isn't quite the one-shot freebie that it otherwise would be. Despite that, however, it doesn't take too many extra turns to beat it with my fighting-type Breloom. We now need to pick up some new Pokemon to replace our lost brethren, so I begin by capturing a Bramblin. I then head just outside Levincia to pick up a Toadscool. Earlier in Kitakami, I made sure to visit this old shack where you can just buy syrupy apples, and this item actually lets you evolve Applin into its newest evolution, Diplin. Well, actually, that's partly not true. While the Teal Mask introduced Diplin, the newly released Indigo Disc lets Diplin evolve again. The only issue is that the TM Dragon Cheer you have to teach Diplin is only available in the post-game, so it's an impossible evolution. Luckily, there is an option available in the Universal Pokemon Randomizer to change impossible evolutions that I usually use in order to enable evolutions like Alakazam or Gengar without trading. And by invoking this optional Nuzlocke rule, we can evolve Diplin right away. And I gotta say, Hydrapple is awesome. I love him. The fact of the matter is, the Water Gym was never going to be particularly difficult, but it's a great time to talk about Hydrapple's strength and weaknesses. At 120, its special attack is pretty dang good, and its defenses are pretty amazing as well. Where it lacks in the stat department is speed. It really won't be outspeeding anything. But in this case, that's not really a problem, since we've got Giga Drain to gain all our health back after we've been hit. Hydrapple's ability, Super Sweet Syrup, works exactly like Intimidate, except it lowers the opponent's evasiveness instead. This makes it a lot more reliable to use some less accurate move that Hydrapple gets, like Hydro Pump or Draco Meteor. As for this gym battle, with a 4 times resistance to water, as you might imagine, it wasn't particularly difficult. The upcoming fight versus Attakus, however, is a terrible matchup for us, so we need to make some preparations. I begin by heading back to Kitakami, where if we talk to Jack, we can get access to a Sinnoh starter egg. This is, of course, a 1 in 3 chance, so I run around until the egg hatches, and it's like it knows we're doing a grass run and and hatches into a Turtwig. I then take the time to do some grinding to evolve our ground types into Toedscruel and Torterra. This is a terrible matchup for our team, but at least in this fight we have some Pokemon that are good against poison, unlike the fight versus Mela. Sadly, we don't have access to a Choice Scarf yet, so Toedscruel won't be able to outspeed Skuntank and thus gets poisoned. A bit of a shame, but a small price to pay to knock it out with an Earth Power. Second out is Muck, which Toedscruel also handles easily. Attakus's regular Revavroom is a bit more of a headache. Heather would fall to an Iron Head, so I swap out into Dandelion, who takes just over half. And after Leftovers recovery, it's questionable whether or not I can take another hit. Here I make my first mega blunder of the run, since I should have remembered Overcoat means Revavroom is immune to Sleep Powder. Dandelion does still hang on with 1 HP, but it's still a massive waste in tempo, especially since I'd love to have Torterra at full health to take on the Starmobile, but alas, I'm left with no other choice. I go for Protect the turn after taking the Iron Head since I'm gonna need as much health as possible, and Iron Head is actually dealing a fair amount of damage. A flinch there would have been absolutely devastating, but luckily my Earthquake connects, leaving just the Starmobile. I once again go for Protect just to get as much health as possible, since I'm unsure how many Noxious Torques I can take. It does about half of my remaining health, and Earthquake hits for a third. Because I didn't get poisoned, I'm pretty confident I can take another Noxious Torque as long as I go for Protect to get that little bit of extra Leftovers recovery. Sadly, after another Protect, I am going to be forced to switch. And because of the Starmobile's toxic debris setting up toxic spikes, whatever I swap in is going to get poisoned. This means that my Bramblegast isn't going to get to retaliate, and I pretty much just sacrifice it, which is a terrible idea. At the time, I wasn't thinking about the fact that Bramblegast is amazing versus Airie. In fact, most of Airie's Pokemon have really good moves against grass types, meaning that while Hydrapple's able to clean up the fight, sacrificing my only fighting immunity may have cost me the run down the line. Defeating Attakus finally puts our level cap at 36, allowing us to fully evolve our starter into Meowscarada, which is an absolute monster. This means we have to face Larry for the first time. And while his flying type team in the Elite Four is a lot more threatening to our grass types, his normal type team still has Staraptor with super effective Aerial Ace. And while Breloom can very easily solo his first two Pokemon, taking out Staraptor without losing a Mon is going to take a little bit of finesse. Obviously Breloom, who's quad weak to flying, is not going to be able to stay in, so I instantly swap out and send in Hydrapple. Hydrapple's second best stat after its special attack is its defense at 110, so I'm able to actually tank a hit at just below half HP. As long as I give it a Citrus Berry, which is pretty common to find in Kitakami, I'm able to tank another hit with just 13 HP to spare. I then launch its signature move Fickle Beam and get the full power version, doing a lot more damage than I need it to before swapping into Torterra. Torterra also takes a little bit over half, but by using the same trick with a Citrus Berry, I'm able to tank another Aerial Ace the following turn, and even if I hadn't gotten the double power Fickle Beam, an Earthquake would still be enough to take out Staraptor, which is pretty funny to see, to be honest, and we win the gym battle. With Staraptor defeated, we at least get to exhale for a moment. Rhyme is a master of ghost types, and while grass and ghosts don't really interact at all, Meowscarada is a dark type and an absolute monster. The only thing that could possibly mess me up in this fight is Play Rough Mimikyu, so I make sure to put it to sleep the very first turn with Wide Lens Sleep Powder from Jumpluff. From there, Meowscarada is free to take out Houndstone the next turn, and Jumpluff breaks Disguise with an Acrobatics. Jumpluff then puts her ace to sleep, and Meowscarada eliminates Mimikyu. Finally, after all the attack boosts from the gym gimmick, Toxtricity stands no chance. We then have to take on Great Tusk, which is pretty much entirely countered by Giga Drain Hydrapple. Our final freebie is the fight versus the Psychic-type leader Tulip. Meowscarada being a Dark type that also gets access to Shadow Claw to one-shot Gardevoir, means it needs no setup whatsoever in order to one-shot every single one of our Pokemon. But despite this epic win streak, our next opponent is an awful matchup. Grusha, the master of ice types, is terrifying to our lineup of plants. There's no way to brute force through this, so we're gonna have to use strategy. Frostmoth is slower than Poppy, so I can put it to sleep with the 100% accurate Spore. The reason I do this instead of going for Rock Tomb immediately is because Rock Tomb has a 5% chance of missing. And because that's exactly what happens, I'm pretty glad I did. Once a quad-effective Rock Tomb takes care of Frostmoth, Grusha's next two Pokemon are both slower than Breloom. This will mean I get to put them to sleep, but unfortunately, a single Drain Punch isn't isn't enough to kill either of them. There was a possibility for Beartic to wake up this second turn, and I would have probably just lost Poppy on the spot, but this risk is one I simply have to take since I don't have Scovillain anymore. I'm pretty sure Choice Scarf Scovillain would have absolutely torched this entire gym, but if one of these Pokemon should wake up, I do have a contingency plan. Breloom does have a Focus Sash, so if Satitan would have woken up, I still could have hung on and taken it out, and it is perfect to have full health going up against Altaria. It does end up missing its Hurricane, which is actually pretty nice, since if that would have confused us, we could have hit ourselves in confusion at 1 HP, and it would have still been the end of Breloom despite the Sash. But Breloom just ends up skating through the fight totally unscathed, which I have zero problem with. Before taking on Ortega, I realized the teal mask gives me access to Bellsprout. Would have been nice to realize before Attakus, but here we are. And Victory Bell is actually kind of the perfect counter against Ortega. Really, any poison or steel type is. I literally did nothing except spam A to press Sludge Bomb and won the fight. Before taking on Airie, who I'm incredibly scared of, I decided to take on Dondozo first, because Big Bozo here is not particularly threatening to my grass types. While I'm in the area though, I pick up a couple of Pokemon that might help me with Airie, namely Tropius and Amoonguss. I then head back to Kitakami again since we actually do get access to a ghost type in Phantom, which we can easily evolve into Trevenant. Airie is a tough cookie to crack. With stamina, her Starmobile is incredibly difficult to take down. But before we can even face it, we have to take on the rest of her stacked lineup. I did give Gardenia a Pecha Berry just in case that Poison Jab would have poisoned, and then Toxicroak simply falls to an Earthquake. Annihilate comes in second, and this thing has both Ice Punch and Fire Punch. Unfortunately, I have no good switches here, so Tropius has to fall, even though it's one of my favorite Hoenn Pokemon of all time. This gives me a free switch to Amoonguss, which is probably my best bet at beating this thing. After taking just less than half from an Ice Punch, I poison it with Toxic, which will be my main mode of damage. Fire Punch then does the same damage as Ice Punch, taking me down into the red, but with Synthesis, I can get back way over half. And with Leftovers, we just make sure we're never gonna go down to a non-crit. From there, I just keep spamming Synthesis, and unfortunately along the way, I end up getting a burn from a Fire Punch. In the long run, getting burned is a small price to pay, since Annihilate is by far the second biggest threat on our team after the Starmobile. Once it goes down, however, we do still have to deal with both Lucario and Passimian. Because Amoonguss still has a pretty decent amount of health, I decide to stay in against the Dragon Pulse, which actually doesn't deal too much damage, and I can put Lucario to sleep with Spore. And because Lucario got put to sleep after it moved, I know that I can guaranteed switch without it waking up. Aster sadly just misses out on the KO with Brick Break, but Lucario just stays asleep, so a second one takes care of it. Passimian is threatening to one-shot Meowscarada with a close combat, so I swap into Trevenant, who's immune to it. Rock Tomb does deal a decent amount of damage, but after going for Will-O-Wisp, I ensure it's not going to be dealing too much damage ever again. I then go for Leech Seed to get some recovery, which in the end is what does Passimian in. Finally, there's only one more Pokemon to face, Aries' Starmobile. I begin by swapping Phlox out to get rid of its speed drops. I then swap in Victory Bell with a bit of a plan in mind as the Starmobile hits me with a spin out. The plan is to remove stamina with Gastro Acid, but of course that doesn't affect Starmobiles either. I was pretty devastated since I actually thought that might work. Because Victory Bell is Choice Scarfed, I have to swap back into Phlox, who at least doesn't take very much damage from the spin out. Phlox does have a Rocky Helmet, which is at least something that affects the Starmobile. Beyond that, I'm sadly just gonna have to deal with stamina, boosting the Starmobile's defense. The next turn, I try a different plan, going for Destiny Bond, which also, of course, doesn't affect the Starmobile. With 3 of my 4 moves in Leech Seed, Will-O-Wisp, and Destiny Bond not having any effect at all, I'm forced to just spam Shadow Claw and keep boosting this thing's defense. On top of that, it's also gonna start boosting its attack and speed with Shift Gear, which is a massive problem. I don't have a single way whatsoever to lower this thing's attack stat, so that boost is just permanent. Phlox then goes down to another spin out, but at least I get a little bit more chip with Rocky Helmet. I send in Victory Bell, who at least resists fighting, and with its Choice Scarf, I can outspeed and do some decent damage on the special side with Sludge Bomb. That is sadly all Victory Bell gets to do before getting road killed by Spin Out. Amoonguss is still burned, but faster because of Spin Out, and Giga Drain hits specially and actually deals a decent amount of damage. This was meant as just another sacrificial play to get more damage, but because of the Giga Drain recovery, Petunia actually manages to survive. She actually picks up the KO with another Giga Drain, which means I only lost 3 Pokemon right before the Elite Four. And the Elite Four is absolutely terrifying for one specific reason, Larry. And because there's only one grass type that takes neutral damage from flying, I've saved catching it for just before the Elite Four. Because otherwise, I would have found some way to lose this Rotom. But to actually make it a grass type, we're gonna have to head to the auction to pick up the Rotom catalog. Hola, amigo, we've got 49 horseradish? Yeah, no thank you, amigo. After overspending on a bidding war to get my catalog, I can finally get Rotom Mow. I also head to Glaciato Mountain to pick up a Snover that I evolve into Abomasnow. And thus, my preparations for the Elite Four were complete. Our matchup versus Larry may be pitiful, but Rika, the master of ground types, not exactly a problem. She leads with Whiscash, a water ground type that I simply blast out of existence with a critical hit Flower Trick. She then sends in the fire type Camerupt, so I'm forced to swap out of Aster, sending in Hydrapple. The super sweet syrup is awesome here, lowering Camerupt's evasiveness before we take a Fire Blast pretty comfortably because of Assault Vest. Because of the syrup, Hydro Pump is 100% accurate, taking out Camerupt, so she sends in Donphan. A Poison Jab doesn't deal too much damage because of Hydrapple's massive defense, but it does land a poison. A Giga Drain takes Donphan down to just 1 HP because of Sturdy, and I get a ton of my health back. Because of the recovery, it's safe to stay in against another Poison Jab, and I just finish off the Donphan with a Fickle Beam. With Donphan defeated, she sends in Dugtrio. It doesn't have Arena Trap, so I'm safe to swap out into Torterra. And on the switch, Dugtrio just sets up Sandstorm, which Torterra doesn't really mind. Earthquake then deals pitiful damage, and a Leaf Storm is enough to take Dugtrio out in one hit. Finally, Rick is left with her ace Clodsire, which doesn't actually have any poison type moves and sheds its poison type once it actually terastalizes. This means it's pretty much zero threat to the team, and a couple of Woodhammers from Abomasnow takes it out, winning the fight. Second, we have to face Poppy, the master of steel types, which isn't an awesome matchup for grass types, but we've got some ground types. I lead with Torterra, which is actually just faster than Caparajah and takes it out with a single Earthquake. The biggest threat on Poppy's team is by far Corviknight. It sets up with Iron Defense, so I won't be dealing too much damage to it directly, but I don't need to by setting up Leech Seed. Corviknight's also going to deal a ton of damage to itself through recoil from using Brave Bird. I can then go for Synthesis, almost recovering back all of my health, and after both Leftovers and Leech Seed recovery, I actually do get back to full. Using this strategy, Corviknight just ends up taking itself out eventually with a Brave Bird. What's awesome about that is I still went for Synthesis, recovering almost all the way back to full health once again. Magnezone is next, so I go for Leech Seed just to break Sturdy and then demolish it with an Earthquake. This leaves her with 2 Pokemon, so she sends in Bronzong. Since I can't one-shot it, I start by setting up Leech Seed for recovery, but then I start spamming Crunch, and eventually it goes down fairly easily. Thus, I only have Tinkaton left to face. And unlike her other Pokemon, Tinkaton is actually faster, and ends up getting a critical hit with Gigaton Hammer, which almost takes Gardenia out. On top of that, it's sadly tanky enough to survive an Earthquake in the red. Since I'm not faster, I have to swap out, sending in Toedscruel, who actually does outspeed, so an Earth Power finishes the fight. But this means I have to face my fears and take on Larry's flying types. Because he leads with Tropius, I can at least send in Abomasnow to take it out with a 100% accurate Blizzard in the snow. This'll bait in Altaria since it knows Flamethrower, which means I definitely have to switch. Toedscruel has a ton of special defense and takes a Flamethrower very comfortably. Even after I do just over half with Dazzling Gleam, not even a quad effective Ice Beam is able to take Heather out. And so, because Heather outspeeds, another Dazzling Gleam takes out Altaria, but this means we've got to face Staraptor. We'll be getting hit by a Brave Bird here, so I swap into the only mon that can take the hit, Rotom. A second one would take Rotom out, and Staraptor is faster, so I equipped Rotom with a Choice Scarf in order to outspeed and take it out with a Thunderbolt. Another Thunderbolt sadly won't be enough to take out Oricorio because of its electric type, so I swap out into Toedscruel in order to get a free switch. We do still have a fair few Pokemon on the box, so it doesn't feel too bad to lose one. I send in Abomasnow, who is Focus Sash, so as long as we don't get flinched by Air Slash, we should be fine. But instead, Oricorio goes for Teeter Dance to confuse me, but Abomasnow is such a beast, it doesn't care and just takes it out with a Blizzard. We're left facing Flamigo, and I really don't want to risk the confusion, so I have to switch. Unfortunately, whatever I swap in is guaranteed to die, so I basically have to try and weigh what's going to be the least useful for the rest of the run. And as crazy as this is going to sound, I think that that's Rotom. There aren't particularly many flying types we still have to face in the rest of the game, and while Rotom's an incredibly good mon, the other 4 mons that are left on my team are pretty much integral for the rest of the game. Besides that, Abomasnow does still have its Focus Sash intact, and because Flamigo has lowered its defense with close combat, we can very easily take it out with Blizzard. Alright, Larry only took down 2 Pokemon, all things considered, that wasn't too bad. Guess what? Grass types have an absolutely abysmal matchup against dragons. At least Hassel's Noivern doesn't have Flamethrower like Drasna's, but we're actually able to take it out in one shot with Meowscarada with a to Life Orb Play Rough. Hassel then sends in Dragalge, a poison type. I'm not looking to get one shot by a Sludge Bomb, so I U-turn for some chip damage, and then swap out into Arboliva, which actually has some decent special defense, particularly with an Assault Vest. Seed Sower setting up terrain gives me a bit more recovery, and Earth Power actually deals a ton of damage. Because of the Assault Vest, I'm able to tank a second Sludge Bomb and then finish off Dragalge with another Earth Power. From there, he sends in Flapple, and expecting it to go for Aerial Ace, I decide to swap out into Abomasnow. It ends up going for Dragon Rush instead, and actually misses. Flapple is slightly faster, so I gave Snowdrop the Choice Scarf in order to outspeed and take out Flapple with a quad-effective Blizzard. Haxorus is next, and even though I probably could take a super effective Iron Head in the snow, I decide to swap out into Gardenia, who pretty much walls this thing. Dragonclaw does deal a fair amount of damage, but I'll get a lot of health back from both Leech Seed and Leftovers. After the next Dragonclaw, I go for Synthesis, which, with Leech Seed and Leftovers, gains me almost all my health back. I then tank yet another Dragonclaw before firing off an Earthquake, which isn't quite enough to take Haxorus out, but the Leech Seed is gonna drain it for the rest, leaving Hassel with his ace Baxcalibur. This thing being an Ice Dragon type is an incredibly rotten deal for my team, and I'm pretty much forced to sacrifice something here in order to get a free switch. Arboliva has done what he came to do and defeated Dragalge, so we bid him adieu. I send in Abomasnow, who sets up the snow, meaning I can take one hit, but then I realize I only have one Blizzard PP left. This is incredibly bad, since I will need 2 to take Baxcalibur out, but I'll be locked into Blizzard because of Choice Scarf. This second Mega Blunder pretty much means I'll have to sacrifice a second Pokemon. But first, I've got to get hit by Glaive Rush, which at least doesn't crit and KO me. I swap out into Petunia, who's still at full health, and I'm expecting a Glaive Rush. But Amoonguss, the absolute boss, doesn't just survive on 15 HP, but puts it to sleep with Effect Spore. This not only saves Amoonguss, but it also gives me a guaranteed free switch into Hydrapple, who is Focus Sashed, so I can't actually lose even if Baxcalibur wakes up. I then fire off a Fickle Beam for the win, meaning we beat Hassel with only one casualty. What remains of the Pokemon League is to take on Champion Geeta, who a lot of people think has a very underwhelming team, but a lot of her Pokemon are actually really dangerous for our grass types. So we're just gonna have to let her rip and see how this goes. Going into this fight, what I'm most worried about is her Avalugg. The thing is very physically bulky, and I don't have a great way to deal with it. However, her first Pokemon is Espathra, which is a lot easier to deal with since a single Life Orb boosted Night Slash takes it out. In comes Gogoat, which does threaten Meowscarada with Play Rough, so I U-turn, which almost picks up the KO, swap out into Snowdrop, activating Snow Warning to boost my defenses, as the Gogoat just sets up with a Bulk Up, which ultimately doesn't matter at all since I just take it out with an Ice Shard the following turn. Kingambit comes in next, and an Iron Head from this thing would absolutely destroy Abomasnow, so I swap out into Gardenia. Iron Head deals a fair amount of damage, so I set up a Leech Seed. But after I see that Kingambit switches moves to Kowtow Cleave, I form a different plan. Because fighting resists Dark, I'm safe to swap in Breloom here, and Kowtow Cleave doesn't do too much. Kingambit is painfully slow, so Breloom outspeeds, gaining all of its health back with a Drain Punch. Veluza comes in next, and this fish is a Psychic type, so I decide to swap out, sending in Aster. Dark is of course immune to the Psycho Cut, and the following turn I can take Veluza out with a Flower Trick. We then face Avalugg, and I'm not going to be able to one-shot this thing, so I U-turn for a bit of chip damage to swap out. Its most powerful move is Body Press, so I swap out into Petunia, who can resist the Fighting type move with its Poison type. Avalugg moves at a glacial pace, so Petunia outspeeds, putting it to sleep with Spore. I then go for Giga Drain, and because Avalugg's special defense isn't anything to write home about, a second Giga Drain does the trick. With Avalugg defeated, only her ace Glamora remains. After Glamora terastalizes into a pure rock type, I decide to stay in since Petunia's at full HP and put the Glamora to sleep with another Spore. I then swap out, sending in my Focus Sashed Hydra. Glamora keeps snoozing, so I go for a Giga Drain, taking out most of its health. It then wakes up and hits Hydrapple with a Sludge Wave, but because I'm Focus Sashed, I'm not worried about it whatsoever. Another Giga Drain then takes it out, and suddenly we've defeated the champion. But even though we've conquered the Pokemon League, we still have some of the most dangerous fights ahead of us before we can face the final boss. The first of those fights I decide to take on is versus Arvin, who does actually have a few problematic Pokemon. After I annihilate his Greedent, he sends in Scovillain. Because it's the only Pokemon neutral to fire I have, I swap in Hydrapple. With an Assault Vest, I'm able to tank Fire Blasts for days and can easily take it out with a few Earth Powers. His Toedscruel is much less of a problem, since I can just swap in Abomasnow and take care of it with a couple of Ice Shards. His Big Mountain of Salt isn't too big a deal either, since I can just swap to Gardenia, who can tank hits from it for days and then knock it out with a few Earthquakes. No, the real problem is his skill link, Cloyster, with Icicle Spear. When planning for this fight, I didn't really find a way around it. I'm just gonna have to sacrifice a Pokemon. Poorly Vanny hasn't gotten to do anything so far in the run. Because it goes for Light Screen on the Switch, I am able to get off a single Leaf Blade, but 5 guaranteed hits from Icicle Spear? Yeah, we ain't surviving that, boss. The Light Screen was a little bit unexpected, since initially I was just gonna take Cloyster out from full with an Energy Ball, but because it's its half health, we're still able to go through with the plan. Finally, there's Mabostiff, which is also a bit of an issue. I start with a super effective U-turn and swap out into Torterra. I'm struck by a Play Rough on the Switch, and then a Crunch before I can set up Leech Seed. Since I know it wants to go for a Dark-type move, I'm free to swap out into Poppy. The Crunch doesn't deal too much damage, and I get a lot of health back from leftovers and Leech Seed. Mach Punch doesn't quite get the KO, but Poppy manages to survive a Play Rough on 2 HP. Legendary performance from Breloom. Also, Mabostiff just goes down to Leech Seed. My fight versus Clavell is a lot less eventful, at least until I face his final Pokemon, Skeledirge. I actually end up having some great luck since it starts raining during the fight right before he sends in the Dirge. Unfortunately, my luck doesn't last, and while I'm deciding what to do, the rain stops. Nothing wants to eat a Torch Song, so sadly, I just have to let Petunia go. Except Petunia, the absolute GOAT, ends up surviving this one too. She then puts Skeledirge to sleep, and I don't really want to swap anything in, risking a wake-up. So the plan is, as long as Skeledirge keeps snoozing, I'm gonna fire off Sludge Bombs. Skeledirge sleeps a second turn, so I get a second Sludge Bomb. I get incredibly lucky, and the Dirge sleeps for a third turn, allowing me to take it down into the red with another Sludge Bomb. At this point, I actually have the option of saving Petunia. Since Aster's holding a Focus Sash, it doesn't matter if Skeledirge wakes up, because even though it does and takes me down to 1 HP with a Torch Song, the following turn, Aster is simply faster, taking out the remainder of the Dirge's health with a Night Slash. Penny of Team Star really only has one threatening Pokemon, and that's of course Flareon. Before it comes in, I knock out both Umbreon and Leafeon. However, I've come up with a tactic that should let us swap to Gardenia safely. The plan is to swap in a Sash to Jumpluff, because once it gets to 1 HP from Flare Blitz, Flareon will want to go for Quick Attack the following turn. Except I get burned, so my entire plan just goes out the window. My Jumpluff just dies, which at least accomplishes the goal of sending in Torterra for free, but like, come on, that sucks. Seriously, just to rub it in, when Torterra comes in, the Flareon just goes for Quick Attack and allows me to take it out with an Earthquake. Absolute bullshit. With only 6 Pokemon remaining, the only person standing between me and the final boss battle is Nemona. She leads with Lycanroc mid-day form, but a simple Flower Trick from Meowscarada is enough to take it out. Her Pawmot is by far what could deal the most damage to me, but a simple Play Rough takes it out in a single hit as well. In fact, same goes for Goodra, so Meowscarada just effortlessly soloed half of Nemona's team. Orthworm has massive defense, so we're not going to be able to one-shot it, so I U-turn out for a bit of chip damage. I swap in Hydrapple, who doesn't take too much damage from a Body Press. Orthworm then misses an Iron Tail, and like an absolute moron, I Earth Power into its Earth Eater. Like, I knew it had Earth Eater. It was the entire reason I didn't swap in Torterra, so that was just a mega blunder number 3. Regardless, Orthworm's special defense is nothing to write home about, so after taking a couple of Iron Tails, I take it out with a few Hydro Pumps. Next out is the abomination we don't mention by name, and because it has Dragon Rush, I definitely have to swap out. The good news is, this thing's pretty much completely walled by Torterra, so I set up a Leech Seed as it starts coiling up and end up taking it out with a few Earthquakes. Finally is her starter, Quackable, and this thing does have Ice Spinner, so I definitely have to swap out, sending in Snowdrop. Ice's only resistance is actually Ice, so we don't take super effective damage from the hit. Brick Break, however, does quite a bit, putting me in range of being KO'd, but not before I get to strike back with a Wood Hammer, dealing a ton of damage. And luckily, the recoil just barely isn't enough to take Snowdrop out. I decide my best course of action is to try and get the KO with Mach Punch, so I swap into Breloom, who tanks an Aqua Step. I was a bit worried that Mach Punch wouldn't take Quackable out, but we'll never know, because Poppy gets an incredibly clutch Effect Spore Paralysis, which means that even though Quackable has boosted its speed once, Poppy is simply faster and can take it out guaranteed with a Seed Bomb, which means that because we defeated Nemona without losing a Pokemon, we get to go into the final fight with a full team of 6. We're in the endgame now. Winning or losing this fight will decide the fate of the run. After so many stupid mistakes, the question remains, can Grass types defeat a Pokemon Scarlet Hardcore Nuzlocke? I've made it this far, and there really is only one way to find out. In order to beat her first Pokemon, I had to teach Meowscarada acrobatics. This unfortunately means I won't be able to equip it with an item, but because it let me one-shot Slitherwing, an incredibly strong bug type, it felt like a fair trade-off. Once Screamtail comes in, I U-turn out since I don't want to take a Drain Punch. It ends up actually being a Play Rough, which works out very well for Snowdrop since it's not super effective. Even so, a super effective Drain Punch deals very little damage in the snow. All I need Abomasnow to do in this fight is take care of this Screamtail. It's the only thing on my team that doesn't take too much damage since this thing has both Play Rough and Ice Punch. The reason I couldn't comfortably use Amoonguss is because it has Stabs and Headbutt. With it defeated, however, we have to deal with yet another problem, Fluttermane. This thing has Mystical Fire and moves at like the speed of light. I go for Ice Shard just to get any damage on this thing before Abomasnow's roasted. Gardenia's been given a Focus Sash, so because we can swap her in for free, I'll always be able to survive the Mystical Fire. It actually does a lot less than I expected, and I'm free to take Fluttermane out because of its terrible defense. In comes Sandy Shocks, which isn't particularly threatening as a ground type. It ends up missing a Flash Cannon due to Friendship, a mechanic I wish you could turn off in Nuzlocke, so Torterra survives and takes it out with Wood Hammer. In a way, this is a bit of a hindrance, since once she sends in Brute Bonnet, it means we're gonna have to hard switch. Well, I'm just gonna have to show this thing that the Modern Mushroom is the way to go. It ends up just Sucker Punching, so I get to swap in for free. Again, I'm unaffected by Sucker Punch because I go for Toxic. Finally, I'm actually hit by the Sucker Punch because this turn I decide to go for Sludge Bomb. Brute Bonnet isn't a poison type, so it's actually super effective. Since I know Brute Bonnet wants to go for Sucker Punch, I'm better off not attacking and just going for Synthesis to get my health all the way back to full, since we're gonna be getting our damage over time with poison anyway. In fact, I do the same the next turn since it's gonna leave me at full health and Brute Bonnet will go down. With 5 Pokemon still alive, I'm feeling pretty good about our chances since she's only left with her ace Pokemon, Roaring Moon. But this thing is still a monster and uses up its booster energy to boost up its attack with Protosynthesis. Petunia could possibly pull this off, but I decide to swap out because there's only one way to finish this Nuzlocke. After sacrificing Torterra, I send in Hydrapple. On switch in, I get the evasion drop with Super Sweet Syrup. Roaring Moon Dragon Claws, but Hydrapple is completely safe with a Focus Sash. And because of the evasion drop, Draco Meteor is 100% accurate. And so, Hydrapple and I had done it. With the rest of the team, we just beat a Pokemon Scarlet Hardcore Nuzlocke using only grass types. And my goodness, if it wasn't one of the most stressful Nuzlockes I've ever played. I hope this worked as a showcase of Hydrapple. I really enjoyed using it, and I gotta say, I really love this Pokemon. I've been Applin pilled since the day Sword and Shield came out. So let me know your thoughts on Hydrapple down in the comments below, and until we see each other next time...